Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions from the food system, where to act. This is the second session of the conference, The Hidden Hero. How can a net zero food system be delivered to the benefit of people and planet? And this conference is all about understanding how the food system can play a key role in delivering our climate change emissions reductions, and one that hasn't had a huge focus in the global debate. We've had the Food Systems Summit, which has helped address this. But in the run-up to COP26, we think it was really important, us, the partners, WRAP, WRI, and UNEP, that it was really important to discuss the role that food systems can play in delivering the highly ambitious targets that we've got, and that's being discussed at COP26. So what we are going to discuss in this session is the role the food system can play in tackling climate change, and what are the priorities for action. This session is, as I've said, is entitled, Where in the Supply Chain Do We Need to Act to Deliver Net Zero Food Systems? And I'm delighted we have two excellent speakers at this particular event. Karen Fisher from WRAP, who will speak about research published today on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions produced worldwide to deliver the UK's consumption of food, and how this could be reduced by half by 2030 to put us on the pathway for full net zero by 2040. And Pierre Boileau from UNEP, who will speak on research led by the UN Environment Programme published last month on the impact of the food systems globally and the priorities for change. Each speaker will provide their contribution, and then we'll have a Q&A session for the remainder of the session. Can I ask you all, please, add in your questions into the box at the bottom of the screen of the Zoom link, so that we can then have a lively debate after the speakers have spoken. Please note the session will be recorded and added to WRAP's website after the event. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Karen Fisher. Karen is Head of Climate Action at WRAP, with nearly 20 years experience in the field of food systems, sustainability, and appraisal. She is currently leading a number of work streams with the food and drink sector focused on tackling the significant challenges of measuring and reducing supply chain greenhouse gas scope 3 emissions. This work involves organizations that span the whole of the food supply chain, including farm bodies, manufacturers and processors, retail and hospitality food service businesses, government representatives, and other stakeholders, and is all embodied in WRAP's groundbreaking Quartile Commitment 2030, which is all about halving greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. Karen, over to you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that introduction. I shall just share my screen with some slides to talk through. And firstly, I thought I would explain the reason why we undertook the research that we published today on food system emissions. So, as Richard noted, in the UK, WRAP leads a voluntary agreement with the food industry called the Quartile Commitment. And that voluntary agreement sets some extremely ambitious targets for the industry to collectively achieve, and we work with them to help aid delivery. And one of those targets is to halve the total emissions linked to the food and drink we consume in the UK by 2030. And that's a really important nearer term milestone to achieve and to set us on the path towards some of the longer term net zero by 2040 or by 2050 targets that the industry has. And we know from recent IPCC reports that near-term action, that early action is absolutely fundamental to being able to keep to a 1.5 degree pathway. So really this target is critical, and in setting it, we needed to understand, actually, can we achieve it? And we also wanted to understand a little bit more about the how. So what scale of reduction could come from different types of action? For example, if renewable energy commitments are met? How would that add up across the food system? What could that deliver? If commitments on zero deforestation are met and achieve the outcomes needed, what would that contribute? If we meet our targets to halve food waste, what will that contribute? And how will all these add up? And does that actually, the sum of those parts, will that get us to our target? So that was our objective. In terms of how we did this, we developed a new and very comprehensive model of the food system that collated emissions estimates across every stage in the value chain. And we broke those emissions estimates down in a huge amount of detail by the various inputs at every stage. So things like electricity, fuel, refrigerants, transport, packaging, agricultural products, not just in the UK, but imported products and ingredients. And all of this drew from a huge number of published studies and national data sets. The full method is available in the report that we published, in the full technical report we published today. And why we broke it down in this way is because building up that level of detail enabled us to investigate the implications of individual changes and also the implications of how they might add up and play out across the whole food system. So what we did is we looked at a number of reduction scenarios out to 2030, and they were based very heavily on existing policy commitments or business commitments, sector level commitments and targets that we know are already in existence and have been adopted, because we were seeking to understand, actually, do these add up? So just to show the first set of findings on this slide. So this is a diagram in the top right-hand corner showing the total emissions estimate for the UK food system. But then in the remainder of the diagram, actually the proportion that comes from different stages. So in yellow there, the proportion that comes from imported food, ingredients, feed, fertilizer, other inputs. And actually those total collectively more than 35%, certainly way more than a third. Then the blue line, agricultural emissions that occur in the UK. The lighter blue line, some of the other inputs to the food system, things like packaging, refrigerant that occur across and are added at different stages in the chain. And then the green lines and the various stages beyond, all parts of the subsequent supply chain, so transportation, retail, hospitality and food service, various other transport stages, and emissions that occur in home as well, associated with cooking and storage of food. So this is the full picture. Total emissions are around 160 million tonnes CO2 equivalents. Also to note on the left-hand corner, the total emissions that we've quantified are linked to the production and distribution of food that we actually then just throw away, are significant, and as others authors have identified. So in this case, we identified around 23% of total emissions are linked to food that we just then throw away. The disposal part being a very small part of the emissions total. It's everything that's gone into producing it. So this gives us some understanding of progress to date. Also in the bottom right-hand corner, we've seen an 8% reduction between 2015 and 2019, and it gives us some understanding of where to be focusing efforts. Then the next chart here is the second part of the findings, which is a pathway to achieving a 50% reduction by 2030. And this is just a pathway. And these various bars here show the estimate of potential reduction for different kinds of activities. So, for example, a couple of the big chunks in the middle here, one of these is if zero deforestation commitments play out and achieve an outcome where we have no tropical deforestation linked to food and drink supply chains. That's the level of emissions reduction that we could see through that action. And then another big chunk in the middle there, that's the sum of all of the commitments being made around adopting renewable energy, policies on grid decarbonisation in the UK and in other territories. That's what we think they could add up to in terms of contribution to a 50% target. I wanted to flag just that some of these are policies and commitments that are made out to 2030, some are longer term. So we've had to make some assumptions and estimates around actually the pace of change that could be achieved by 2030. And that's led to some of the ranges that you see on these charts with the dual colour bars. And also this pace of change is one of the reasons why some of these bars are a little smaller than you might expect, like on the left-hand side, agricultural productivity and carbon storage. We've had to make some realistic assumptions around the pace of change that might be achievable by 2030. And then final point to note on this slide is on the right-hand side, we've included a dietary change scenario. And actually this scenario is simply about more of the UK population adopting national guidelines for healthy eating. So the Eat Well guide in the UK is our healthy eating guideline. So if more of the UK population adopted that, it gives us a decent chunk of savings, and that's about the quantity and the types of food. So all of that gives us, and we have much more detail under each of those bars, and it helps us shape our delivery activities. But also, I suppose, a few key takeaways for me are that, firstly, there is a pathway to achieving 50% reduction, albeit some of those bars are extremely challenging, which really means that we must have robust plans and delivery plans against each of these bars to ensure that we do deliver on these commitments, because they are all important. They will all add up. All of the actions matter. There's no silver bullet solutions here. And pace also really matters. We know that we have to deliver quickly to meet these near-term targets, and the importance of near-term action just cannot be overstated. We also repeatedly make the point that we need a robust means of monitoring progress over time to know that actions are having the right effect. And we will be undertaking this kind of analysis every few years to ensure that we are on the right track. And then the final point, I think, is now being made a lot more and needs to be made a lot more, which is that we need to consider the UK's wider consumption footprint to prevent just simply offshoring our emissions. It's a global food system. We can't just reduce UK territorial emissions at the expense of just shifting onto more imports and increasing emissions more globally. Last slide from me, which is just to note that while we'll use this work to really understand how to tailor our delivery programmes, we're also planning more research to understand some of the important nuances and interactions between interventions. So we need a holistic approach on all of this. We know that there is some potential for unintended consequences. So, for example, we know that fruit and veg are wasted at higher rates than other food items. So policies trying to encourage dietary change, we need to be quite careful that those don't lead to unintended consequences in terms of increasing food waste. And we need to take a more nuanced approach there. We're also looking at understanding some of the trade-offs between emissions reductions and other environmental objectives and other priorities as well, like animal welfare. We need to ensure, we think that probably there are mostly synergies between emissions reductions and other environmental outcomes, but we need to absolutely make sure we maximise these collective outcomes and multiple beneficial effects. And then we also need and must strive for better data. Particularly in the UK, we need better data to represent emissions from global supply chains, and we're working very heavily to improve those estimates. And then we also think that this work could be replicable for other countries. We've built this model that could be adaptable for other territories. So we're looking to see how that could play out. So I believe I may have taken my 12 minutes. And Richard, I don't know if you are there, but just want to say thanks so much for listening and joining the session today.
Thank you.
Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. And yes, indeed. And can I just say thank you for introducing this thought-provoking research. I mean, it was doing a huge undertaking and some really impressive analysis. I mean, I guess for me, one of the takeaways is it's good to see that halving greenhouse gas emissions is possible by 2030 against a 2015 baseline. But as you said, the scale of the challenge is hugely significant. It's going to need an awful lot of focused efforts. And it's good to see there are clear priorities for action to halve greenhouse gas emissions. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions though, so I hope you're going to be prepared for that. And can I just say to everybody, please put your questions into the Q&A box. Anything that's provoked in you, having listened to Karen's excellent presentation. Thank you very much indeed, Karen. Look forward to seeing you in the Q&A session shortly.
Thanks, Richard.
And it's now my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Pierre Boileau from the United Nations Environment Programme. Pierre is the head of the Global Environmental Outlook Programme. In this role, he has led a team to complete the 6th Global Environmental Outlook, which was published in March 2019, and a huge undertaking, as well as 6 regional assessments. And as part of the 6th Global Environmental Outlook, Pierre's teams worked closely with more than 160 experts and authors to produce the analysis contained in the publication. Pierre will speak on research on the impact of the food systems globally and the priorities for change. Thank you for joining us, Pierre, today, and over to you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll just share my screen and provide a few slides. Try and stick to my 12 minutes. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to present. Most of what I'm going to speak about is contained in the GEO6 and also a couple of other assessments. One done by the World Resources Institute and UNEP and UNDP called Creating a Sustainable Food Future, and the other one done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on climate change and land. But first, I'll give a little bit of a shout out to the funders of the 6th Global Environment Outlook. Several governments provided funding, including the European Union, Government of Norway, Government of Italy, Thailand, Egypt, Mexico, Switzerland, Government of Denmark. And we had a number of research institutions such as Grit Arendal, MIT in the US, PBL in the Netherlands, Free University in Berlin, and our own UNEP WCMC contributed to the work. The findings from the Global Environment Outlook have been digested in a report that Richard mentioned earlier that we launched about a month ago on the role of business in achieving a sustainable food future. But I'll speak mainly to the findings of the report, the main report, which was launched in 2019. And there are really 3 main areas that we need to have some action on. Of course, food waste is one critical area. About a third of global food is wasted, 56% in developed countries and 44% in developing countries. It's either lost prior to being brought to market or wasted after market. We also have a diminishing land resource and a diminishing water resource, mostly because of climate change. We have land that's being lost through desertification and degradation, and we have, of course, more droughts that are leading to less available fresh water. We also have a number of health and environmental impacts from the current food system. It overuses chemicals, fertilizers, and pharmaceuticals, leading to increases in antimicrobial resistance, along with intensive farming practices that are making food production unsustainable. And one key statistic is that 77% of all agricultural land is currently used for meat production. So as I said, there are some key statistics. 70% of all fresh water is used for food production. 50% of habitable land is currently used for food production. Greenhouse gas agriculture, the whole food system produces about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions each year. And the food system leads to about 70 to 80% of biodiversity loss globally. And that's mainly from land degradation, habitat fragmentation, and loss of carbon from soils. We have a greenhouse gas emissions gap that was identified by the World Resources Institute report of about 70%. Globally, we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector from about 15 gigatons to about 4 gigatons globally by 2050. And we have a land gap. Currently, we use 50% of habitable land for growing food. We need to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people on the planet without using any more land than we do today, because there are many more uses of land that have to come into play. So as I said, food waste is one of our challenges. About 24% of all calories produced are wasted, and that amounts to about a loss of about 750 billion to 1 trillion US dollars each year. Food losses and waste used up about 28% of the world's agricultural land. They amounted to about 4.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, or about 10% of global GHG emissions, so would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter globally if it was ranked within countries. If we can't reduce food waste, we need to find other ways of processing food waste, such as composting and conversion to liquid fertilizers, biogas, or other high-value end products. But if we manage to reduce food waste, we'd have more land available for agricultural production, and therefore we'd be able to move to more environmentally friendly agricultural production like regenerative agriculture, organic farming. Here's the statistic on loss of land, or land that is being lost. About the temperature over land, although we have a 1.1 degree average global temperature increase, we've actually seen a 1.5 degree temperature increase over land. This has led to more desertification, about 500 million people living in areas that experienced desertification, and more land degradation. About a quarter of the ice-free land on the Earth has shown degradation. Soil erosion from fields is estimated to be 10 to 20 times, up to 100 times higher than the soil reformation rate. So all of these statistics from the IPCC land report are actually quite relevant to the discussion today. Of course, diets are a very important piece. Karen mentioned it earlier. We receive about 60% of our protein globally from plant-based sources. We also receive a lot of protein from animal-based sources. Beef, goat, and sheep, or ruminant animals, are the least efficient sources of protein, and also consume the most land, produce the most greenhouse gas emissions per ton. Eggs, milk, pork, poultry, and fish are the most efficient sources of animal protein. And we found that regionally Western-style diets consume almost double the land and produce nearly double the GHG emissions compared to the world average. So the World Resources Institute really looked at scenarios that would help us reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from these sources. Livestock production is responsible for 9% of those emissions. and 50% of all GHG emissions from the agricultural system are coming from livestock production. So livestock sector uses, as I said, about 3/4 of agricultural land. Pathways that reduce meat consumption and lead to adoption of more plant-based diets could substantially reduce the environmental footprint. So there are behavioral changes that we have to talk about, dietary changes. And we can also switch to rotational livestock grazing and pasture management techniques that would also reduce the GHGs from each animal if we decided to move in that direction. As I said, chemicals and pharmaceuticals are a big issue within the current food system. The main issue right now is that antimicrobial resistance could be the leading cause of death by 2050. This is a World Health Organization finding. And of course, it's coming mainly from human and animal excreta. And this is potentially another pandemic in waiting. Pesticides are sometimes composed of industrial chemicals and organic pollutants that are associated with endocrine disruption, so affect the human reproductive system. And this could potentially cause multi-generational effects for human and wildlife. So ultimately, we need pathways that will allow us to reduce the environmental impact of the food system by about 2/3. We are headed in the wrong direction. The scenarios that we looked at in the greenhouse gas global environment outlook, we're saying that we would actually need to produce 50% more food, creating about 50% more environmental impact between now and 2050. And we need to look at a pathway that would reduce that environmental impact significantly. What was proposed in the global environment outlook was to first reduce food waste significantly, and then look at dietary changes or demand-driven changes to be able to get us to the reductions that we need. Finally, the global food system is central to sustainable development. Of course, we have sustainable development goals on ending hunger and ending poverty, and we have to respect those goals. We have to meet those goals. This global food system significantly affects and is affected by environmental and socioeconomic dynamics. Agriculture also provides significant jobs and employment. 30% of the global workforce. Smallholder farmers produce more than half of the global calories. 57 million people work in fisheries and aquaculture. So it is socially important to maintain the food system. But we need to achieve this 1.5 or 2 degree pathway in climate. Otherwise, we will have significant impacts on the food system from droughts, from more severe and more frequent weather events. And in doing that, our best approach is to look at a demand-side driven approach that would allow society to adapt to more plant-based diets. We need a whole systems approach to be able to reduce the agri-food system's environmental footprint and increase its overall efficiency and resilience. So thank you very much, everyone. Richard, back to you.
Thank you very much, Pierre. That was excellent. To cover so much in such a short time frame, I really appreciate that. That was, and also just shows the scale of the challenge again that we face on a global level. I was really struck by your graph that sort of said, well, that's the projection, and we've got to do that. When you look at it in those terms, you think, oh, that's just huge what we have to do. That's absolutely huge. Well, now it's my pleasure to start the Q&A session, and Karen, I believe, is coming back to join us so that we can have all three of you there. And we have already got a burgeoning number of questions for you both. I think I'm going to start with some top line ones. There are some detailed ones which will be coming your way as well, just to give you a heads up. But the first one from me, which I'm going to address to you first, Pierre, which is, what do you think are the key challenges from that? I'm really looking for the key challenges in driving food system change across the world, and how in outline might these be addressed? And Karen, feel free to add to Pierre's answer.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I mean, in our brief that we did, that we published a month ago, we identified 3 key challenges. One is moving production to be more regenerative and essentially what we call nature positive. So we need a global food system that by the end of this decade will not be degrading nature as much as it does right now. And by 2050, will actually be restoring nature. So we have, under UNEP's guidance, the decade of ecosystem restoration that is underway right now. So we need a food system that is going to restore ecosystems. We also need a clear discussion of how dietary change can help us not only improve nutrition, improve food security, but reduce the environmental impact of the food system. And the clear thing that I see is that nutritionists and food security experts and environmental experts all agree that some form of discussion on dietary change needs to happen for us to have a stable food system. And then the last one is to deal with food waste in a really aggressive way, to be able to get the food waste down to a manageable level. Food loss is also a very important discussion to have. And that's mainly a discussion in developing countries. Food loss before getting to market is actually much more an important issue to discuss there.
And I guess for me to chip in now, so absolutely second all of those points, particularly also some of the interactions between those points. So for example, food waste and dietary change, and how we can affect behavior change so that there aren't some of the trade-offs that we might see, and we maximize actually the outcomes that we need to see. I would say also to Pierre's first point around the need, and I think there is widespread understanding of the need for just moving towards more regenerative systems. The challenge, as I see it, one of the challenges is sheer complexity. So for businesses, I mean, emissions mostly sit in supply chains. The complexity of global supply chains is astonishing, and understanding all of that. And then we're also talking about biological systems, which are inherently variable and uncertain as well, and subject to change, and subject to influence by things like the weather, which can actually make our food system emissions go up and down accordingly, affecting yields and such like. So it's a kind of a dynamic system. And then I would say a fundamental challenge, I have been astonished by the lack of robust information available for decision making at every point in the chain, and cracking that nut, I think, will unlock a huge amount of opportunity. And we're really focusing.
Thank you, Karen. Sorry to come over you there just briefly. I mean, and that was an excellent introduction to almost the rest of the conference. Yeah. Session 3, we'll talk about farmers and growers. Session 4, the supply chain and that immense complexity that you've just described. And then, of course, Session 5 on citizens and how we might work with them for the changing, and those synergies that you've talked about, I'm sure will come across. And indeed, setting the right environment for change. That, you know, how do we encourage it and make it as easy as possible as the last session. So. Exactly that. So I'm thinking, we've talked about the complexity and the difficulty. I'm just wondering, Karen, how do you think we can rapidly drive food system change, particularly over the next 9 years, which you emphasized, the earlier we act, the bigger the impact. So what should we prioritize?
So I think actually this also came up in the last session, and probably a bit of a running theme, because in many cases, particularly when we're talking about supply chain emissions, a lot of the actions are reasonably well known, but actually in terms of the cost of adopting them, particularly when we're talking maybe at farm level, for example, the cost of adopting best practice or being able to appropriately finance or take on the risk of trying out new solutions or measures that are less well tried and tested. In both instances, actually, it's the financing point that is a big challenge. And I think financing and incentives and access to those via various means will be a really important driver for change and for unlocking opportunities. And I very much would urge people to listen back to the session this morning and some of the really interesting points that Andy Grippers, Geeta and James were making on exactly that issue.
Yeah, I completely agree. Pierre, do you want to add to anything to that?
Yeah, I think certainly if we speak about the way that the food system is currently subsidized and the finance that goes into the food system in different parts of the world, that needs to be, I think, redirected towards the type of food system that we want in the future. Right now, it's encouraging excess chemical use, excess use of antibiotics, excessive harm to the land. And I think that financing needs to be shifted towards the types of agricultural production that we want to see in the future.
It was also talked about earlier about how farmers are custodians of the land and of our ecosystems and all of the ecosystem services that the landscape provides. And actually, there are nature-based solutions that deliver multiple beneficial outcomes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. And Karen, one of the questions that's come in is a specific one I thought we could address is, do we know if the 8% reduction in total emissions that have been delivered so far between 2015 and 2018, the baseline, was mostly driven by changes in production practices, data changes, or food waste reduction? Just wonder if you can comment briefly on that, please.
Yeah, a mix, but actually the largest driver of that change was the underlying decarbonisation of the UK's grid electricity. So that delivered actually a lot of emissions reductions at stages which are high energy consumers or electricity consumers. So at home, for example, and also as manufacturing, retail, hospitality and food service. So that was the bulk, but also in the UK, we've had really successful waste prevention programs, which we think has contributed a decent chunk to that as well.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm just thinking about a sort of, because we're coming to the end of this session, I'm just thinking to finish up. I wonder if we might discuss how we could communicate the scale of the challenge, and you both have done a great job in that today, and particularly though, build momentum to deliver these hugely ambitious targets. And Pierre, I wonder if I could start with you on that and then move to Karen.
Yes, thank you, Richard. I think that what we want to do is to highlight the ultimate benefits of this change, because right now the food system, about 800 million people are undernourished, 2 billion people are overnourished or having too much food, and there are many diseases associated with all of that. So there's a human health component of this that I think we need to link the environmental discussion with the human health discussion, with the food security discussion, because the transformation that we're talking about in the environment, on the environmental side, will actually dramatically benefit those issues as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And Karen, the last word goes to you.
Yeah, I'd also agree with that, focusing on the benefits here, but also I was recently struck by someone saying about what's helped in our fight against the pandemic is availability of information, clear metrics. That has helped at every point along the way, with knowing where to pinpoint efforts, with being able to communicate progress, monitor over time, and really kind of get to grips with a problem of that scale. And I think information, better information, will be kind of an important tool in our fight against climate change as well.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely critical, because I think that measurement and monitoring, knowing what works and what doesn't, is going to be so key. But also that is going to be central to building the momentum, because this is such a big transformation. And James and Geeta and Andy all said this in the first session. This is such a big transformation. It can be daunting, but by breaking it down, as you both have done, into manageable parts and monitoring progress, I think could make a massive difference. So thank you to both of you, to the excellent speakers in this session, Karen and Pierre, for such clear presentations and such a thoughtful debate. The questions we weren't able to get to in the time available, and there are quite a lot of them in the Q&A, will be answered by the speakers that you've identified, or by both the speakers, and we'll put that on the event website over the next couple of days. And the recording of the event will also be posted if you'd like to listen to the session again or like to catch up on the other sessions. In 10 minutes at 2 o'clock UK time, 3 o'clock European time, and 9 a.m. in Eastern Standard Time, the next session will explore the priorities for farmers and growers. And there's an excellent lineup of speakers from the UK retailer Morrison's, the Sustainable Food Trust, the international fast food chain McDonald's, and Wageningen University from the Netherlands. It will be moderated by RAP's CEO, Marcus Gover, and your existing Zoom link will work for this session and the remainder of the sessions for the rest of the day. There will be a holding slide for a few minutes prior to the next session, and it will start promptly on the hour. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this second session of the conference, The Hidden Hero: How can a net zero food system be delivered to the benefit of people and planet? And I do hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.